Imagine looking out across the water and seeing not just a warship, but something resembling a fortress tower that somehow decided to go for a swim. In the early 20th century, navies around the world were locked in a frantic race, each trying to build bigger, faster, and more powerful battleships than the last. Amidst this technological arms race, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a vessel that would become one of the most visually distinctive warships ever built. The battleship Fusō. Named after an ancient poetic term for Japan itself, the Fusō was more than just steel and guns. It was a statement of intent, a symbol of rising industrial might, and a ship destined for a dramatic, fiery end in the crucible of World War II. The story of the Japanese battleship Fusō begins in the early 1900s, a time when the echoes of the Russo-Japanese War still resonated. Japan, having emerged victorious, was determined to secure its place as a major naval power. The British launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 had revolutionized battleship design, rendering all previous battleships obsolete overnight. Every navy scrambled to respond, and Japan was no exception. They needed their own dreadnoughts, ships that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best the West could offer. The Fusō class was conceived as Japan's answer, intended not just to match, but, in some respects, to surpass the latest designs emerging from British and American shipyards. Design work began around 1908, driven by the ambition to create a battleship that blended heavy firepower with high speed, a challenging combination that often required compromises. The naval architects aimed for a main armament superior to existing dreadnoughts and battlecruisers. Initial concepts played with various gun layouts, eventually settling on a truly unique arrangement: 6 twin turrets housing massive 14-inch guns. This gave the Fusō a potential broadside of 12 heavy shells, a fearsome capability for its time. However, the placement of these turrets was unconventional. 2 forward, 1 amidships just behind the funnel, and 3 aft, all mounted on the centerline. This layout, particularly the amidships turret nestled amongst the superstructure and machinery spaces, presented challenges. It limited the turret's firing arc and potentially exposed critical machinery areas to the blast effects of its own guns. Furthermore, the sheer length required to accommodate 6 turrets stretched the hull, making it a larger target and requiring more armor for adequate protection. Construction began at the renowned Kure Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's premier shipyards. The keel was laid down in March 1912, a tangible beginning for this ambitious project. Building such a vessel was a monumental undertaking, pushing the limits of Japanese industrial capacity at the time. Over the next 3 years, the ship took shape, plate by plate, rivet by rivet. Finally, on March 28, 1914, the massive hull slid down the slipway and into the water. The Fusō was launched. Fitting out followed, installing the complex machinery, intricate systems, and of course, the heavy armament. On November 8, 1915, the Japanese battleship Fusō was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy under the command of Captain Kozo Sato. As completed, Fusō was an imposing sight. She measured approximately 665 feet in length, with a beam of around 101 feet and a draft of nearly 32 feet. Her displacement at full load was close to 40,000 tons. Power came from 24 Miyabara water tube boilers, initially coal-fired, feeding 4 steam turbines that drove 4 propellers. This machinery was designed to give her a top speed approaching 23 knots, or about 26.5 miles per hour. Respectable for a battleship of her size and era, edging towards the speeds envisioned by her designers, who sought that blend of battleship punch and battlecruiser legs. Her main battery, those 12 14-inch guns spread across 6 twin turrets, was her primary claim to fame. Developed by Japan's leading armament manufacturers, these guns could hurl heavy, armor-piercing shells over considerable distances. The centerline arrangement, despite its quirks, allowed all 12 guns to fire on either broadside, maximizing her firepower in a traditional line-of-battle engagement. Secondary armament consisted of 16 6-inch guns mounted in casemates along the hull sides, intended to deal with smaller, faster threats like destroyers and torpedo boats. Anti-aircraft defense was initially meager, typical for the pre-air power era, consisting of just a few 3-inch guns. 6 submerged 21-inch torpedo tubes rounded out her offensive capabilities, another feature common on early dreadnoughts, but one that would gradually fall out of favor. Armor protection was substantial, reflecting the dreadnought philosophy. The main waterline belt armor was between 9 and 12 inches thick, designed to resist battleship caliber shells. Below the main belt, the armor tapered to about 4 inches. Deck armor, however, was relatively thin by later standards, ranging from about 1¼ to 2 inches thick. This reflected the expectation of flatter trajectory gunfire at typical battle ranges of the time. The danger of plunging fire from long-range and aerial bombs was not yet fully appreciated. The gun turrets themselves were heavily armored, particularly on their faces. Despite being commissioned during World War I, Fuso saw no combat in that conflict. Japan's naval role was largely focused on securing sea lanes in the Pacific and Indian Oceans and supporting Allied efforts. Fuso spent much of this period patrolling off the coast of China or participating in fleet exercises in home waters. In 1918, following the war's end, she participated briefly in the Siberian intervention, escorting Japanese troop convoys, a far cry from the high-seas battleship clashes her designers had envisioned. The interwar period proved to be a time of significant transformation for the Fuso. Naval technology continued to advance rapidly, driven by innovations in gunnery, fire control, propulsion, and the emerging threat of air power. Lessons learned from World War I, particularly the Battle of Jutland, highlighted the need for improved armor, especially deck protection against plunging shells, and better damage control capabilities. Furthermore, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 placed strict limits on new battleship construction, forcing navies to modernize their existing capital ships rather than simply building new ones. Fuso, along with her sister ship Yamashiro, was earmarked for extensive reconstruction to keep her viable in this evolving naval landscape. The first major reconstruction took place between 1930 and 1933. This overhaul focused on enhancing her survivability and fighting power. Her forecastle deck was extended aft, connecting with the upper deck to improve seakeeping. Anti-torpedo bulges were added to the hull, increasing her beam but providing crucial underwater protection. Internally, the horizontal armor over the machinery and magazine spaces was significantly thickened, adding hundreds of tons of steel to better withstand plunging fire and bombs. The original 24 coal-fired boilers were replaced with 6 new, more efficient oil-fired canpon boilers, significantly improving her endurance and reducing the large crew complement needed for coal handling. While the original turbines were retained, the increased steam pressure from the new boilers boosted her horsepower, allowing her to maintain her original design speed despite the added weight. Her forward funnel was removed, trunking the boiler uptakes into a single, larger funnel further aft. Perhaps the most visually dramatic change during this period, and continued in a second phase, was the rebuilding of her forward superstructure. This began the process that would eventually lead to her iconic, towering pagoda mast. This complex structure grew layer upon layer, housing the bridge, fire control platforms, searchlights, rangefinders, and various command facilities. While often criticized by Western observers as looking top-heavy and potentially unstable, these pagoda masts were a characteristic feature of modernized Japanese capital ships, reflecting their approach to concentrating command and control functions vertically. The initial anti-aircraft armament was also upgraded, though it remained relatively light by later World War II standards. A second, even more extensive reconstruction followed from 1937 to 1938, though some sources suggest completion stretched into the early 1940s. This phase saw further improvements. Her hull was lengthened at the stern by about 25 feet to improve hydrodynamic efficiency and compensate for the added weight. Her propulsion machinery was completely replaced with new geared turbines and improved canpon boilers, further increasing her power output and potential speed, pushing it closer to 25 knots, or nearly 29 miles per hour. The elevation of her main 14-inch guns was increased, extending their maximum range considerably. Her secondary armament of 16 6-inch guns was reduced to 14, and their elevation was also increased. Most importantly, her anti-aircraft suite received a significant boost with the addition of twin 5-inch dual-purpose guns and numerous 25mm automatic cannons, a recognition of the rapidly growing threat from the air. The final stages of the Pagoda mast construction were completed, reaching its full, dizzying height. Aircraft handling facilities, including a catapult and capacity for 3 float planes for scouting and spotting, were also installed aft. By the time these reconstructions were complete, Fuso was a profoundly different ship from the one launched in 1914. She was heavier, better protected, faster, though still not truly fast compared to newer designs, and bristled with a much more potent anti-aircraft battery. Her silhouette, dominated by that unmistakable pagoda mast, was unique. She and her sister Yamashiro were transformed, equipped with advanced capabilities intended to keep them relevant on the modern battlefield. However, despite these efforts, the fundamental limitations of their original design remained. The awkward turret layout persisted, and even with the modernizations, they were still fundamentally 1910-era dreadnoughts trying to compete in a 1940 world. Newer battleships like the Yamato class being secretly constructed, or contemporary ships from the US and Britain, boasted superior firepower, protection, and speed. As World War II erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Fuso found herself part of the Imperial Japanese Navy's main battle fleet. Initially assigned to the 2nd Division of the 1st Fleet alongside her sister Yamashiro and the battleships Ise and Hyuga, her early war service was relatively uneventful. While elements of the fleet sailed for the attack on Pearl Harbor, Fuso remained in Japanese home waters, sortying briefly as part of a pursuit force after the attack, but failing to make contact. She served primarily as a training platform and part of the strategic reserve, held back from the initial, far-ranging carrier offensives. In April 1942, following the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, Fuso and other elements of the fleet were sent out in an attempt to intercept the American carrier force responsible. Once again, the search proved fruitless, the American ships having already withdrawn eastward. In June 1942, she sailed as part of the Aleutian Guard Force during the Battle of Midway operation, providing distant cover for the invasion of Adu and Kiska. This operation, intended as a diversion for the main attack on Midway, saw no naval combat in the Aleutians theater involving Fuso. The disastrous loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway itself shifted the strategic balance in the Pacific, and the role of older battleships like Fuso began to change. With the carrier fleet weakened and the war becoming a grinding attritional conflict across the islands of the South Pacific, the value of battleships for shore bombardment and troop transport increased. Fuso, considered too slow and vulnerable to operate effectively with the remaining fast carriers, found herself increasingly relegated to these auxiliary duties. Throughout 1943, she spent considerable time at the major naval base of Truk Lagoon, acting as a fleet in being and occasionally participating in troop movements or providing anti-aircraft support within the anchorage. She also continued to serve as a training vessel. Compared to the newer battleships or the fast carrier groups engaging in major battles like Guadalcanal or the Solomon Islands campaign, Fuso's war was, up to this point, relatively quiet. She received further upgrades to her anti-aircraft armament and radar systems during refits in Japan, reflecting the ever-increasing danger posed by American air power. Yet, she had yet to fire her main guns in anger at an enemy warship. That all changed dramatically in October 1944. The United States had launched its massive invasion of the Philippines, landing troops on the island of Leyte. For Japan, the loss of the Philippines would sever their vital supply lines from Southeast Asia and cripple their war effort. The Imperial Japanese Navy conceived a desperate, complex plan called Shogo 1, Operation Victory 1, to repel the invasion. It involved converging multiple naval forces on the Leyte Gulf landings from different directions, hoping to catch the American amphibious forces and their covering fleet in a pincer movement and achieve a decisive naval victory. Fuso was assigned to the Southern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura. This force, centered around Fusō and her sister ship Yamashiro, along with the heavy cruiser Mogami and 4 destroyers, was tasked with penetrating Leyte Gulf from the south via the Surigao Strait. It was a perilous mission. Nishimura's force was relatively weak compared to the potential opposition, lacked air cover, and would have to navigate the narrow, treacherous strait at night. Intelligence suggested the Americans were aware of their approach. It was, in many ways, a sacrificial mission, intended to draw off American forces or, if lucky, wreak havoc among the vulnerable transports in the Gulf. As Nishimura's southern force steamed towards Surigao Strait on the night of October 24, 1944, they sailed into a meticulously prepared American trap. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the U.S. 7th Fleet's Bombardment and Support Group, had positioned his forces to maximum advantage. Rows of PT boats waited in the darkness, followed by destroyer squadrons poised for torpedo attacks. And finally, the imposing battle line of 6 veteran American battleships, 5 of which were survivors of Pearl Harbor, now seeking vengeance, arrayed across the northern exit of the strait, perfectly positioned to cross the T of the advancing Japanese column. This classic naval tactic allowed the American battleships to bring all their main guns to bear on the approaching enemy, who could only reply with their forward turrets. The ordeal began shortly after 10:30 p.m., when American PT boats made contact and launched harassing torpedo attacks. While largely ineffective in terms of hits, they served as an early warning system and disrupted the Japanese formation. Then came the destroyers. Around 3 a.m. on October 25th, American destroyer squadrons launched coordinated torpedo attacks from both sides of the strait. The results were devastating. Multiple torpedoes struck the Japanese column. Fuso was hit. Accounts differ, but it's believed she took 1 or possibly 2 torpedoes on her starboard side, likely from the destroyer USS Melvin. The impact caused massive flooding and likely started uncontrollable fires, possibly igniting fuel stores. What happened next is shrouded in the chaos of the night battle and conflicting eyewitness accounts. Some reports, including initial American assessments, claimed the Fuso exploded catastrophically, breaking in 2 and sinking rapidly. Burning fuel spreading across the water may have contributed to this impression of a massive detonation illuminating the strait. However, survivor accounts, though tragically few, suggest a different end. Hideo Ogawa, one of the handful who made it back to Japan, stated the ship took on water, lost speed, fell out of formation, and began to sink slowly after being torpedoed. Fires raged uncontrollably, particularly amidships. The sheer amount of damage sustained was overwhelming. Regardless of the exact sequence, the outcome was grimly certain. The mighty Japanese battleship Fuso, once a symbol of naval power, was doomed. Consumed by flames and torn apart by internal explosions or succumbing to massive flooding, she lost stability. Sometime between 3:38 and 3:50 a.m., less than an hour after being hit, the Fuso slipped beneath the dark waters of Surigao Strait. Whether she broke apart or sank largely intact but upside down, as later wreck surveys suggest, remains a point of discussion among historians. The wreck, discovered decades later, lying at a depth of about 600 feet, was found upside down, mostly in one piece except for the bow section and the detached Pagoda mast, lending credence to the idea that she did not violently explode into 2 distinct halves as initially thought. The human cost was staggering. Out of a crew estimated to be between 1,600 and 1,900 men, only about 10 survivors are known to have been rescued and eventually returned to Japan. Some others may have been picked up by the Japanese destroyer Asagumo, only for that vessel to be sunk later in the battle as well, taking almost all hands with it. Fuso's sister ship Yamashiro met a similar fate shortly afterward in the same battle, overwhelmed by torpedoes and the crushing gunfire of Oldendorf's battle line. The Battle of Surigao Strait was a catastrophic defeat for Nishimura's southern force, and marked the last time in history that battleships would engage each other in a traditional line of battle action. Air power had already become dominant, but in the narrow confines of Surigao Strait, under the cover of darkness, the big guns had one final, brutal say. The legacy of the Japanese battleship Fuso is complex. She was a product of the intense naval ambitions of the early 20th century. A ship whose unique design, especially after her modernizations, made her instantly recognizable. Her towering pagoda mast became an emblem of the Imperial Japanese Navy's distinct approach to warship design. Yet, she also represented the limitations of trying to keep older designs relevant in the face of rapid technological change. Her service life spanned 2 world wars, but she only experienced true combat in her final, fatal hours. Her destruction, along with her sister ship and most of their crews, stands as a stark reminder of the ferocity of naval warfare in World War II and the tragic human cost of conflict. The ship, named after ancient Japan, now rests on the seabed, a silent monument to a bygone era of naval power and the thousands of sailors who served aboard her.